All right, so hello everyone and welcome. My name is Dexter Weimer. I'm going to help to be moderating this session and all future Preceptor Development Series sessions. I am helping Mandy as the PGY1 Program Coordinator to help with everything in terms of additional Preceptor Development sessions, scheduling for residents, those types of things alongside of her. So as the Preceptor Development Series sort of coordinator by default, I am delighted to welcome Salem and Sue to be giving our first session. And we're really excited to see all the things that they have to share with us in these two sessions that are very, very needed this time of year versus a statistics refresher as we're doing all of our research projects and getting ready to gear up for those types of things with our residents. And then setting expectations, which is always needed whenever we're starting a new learning experience or a new interaction with the resident. So we look forward to both of these. Just as a reminder, these are the learning objectives for the series. This session will be recorded, so if anybody wants to go back and watch it, I will provide that information afterwards that you can go back and do. And there will be CE credit with a link provided following the session. So these are the learning objectives for the series, not for the individual session. Each of our presenters have their own individual learning objectives. In terms of disclosures, nobody involved with this presentation has anything to disclose that's relevant to the presentation content. This is just our certification of CE credit. Again, there's no charge for this. We will be putting a 2-week cap on the CE. So when I send out the link, I'll include the date, which is September the 24th is the last date that you're able to claim CE credit for this session. And with that, I will turn it over to Salem Kamalay, who is our first presenter tonight on Statistics Refresher. And I'll let Salem take it away. Thank you, Salem.
Thanks, Dexter. Hi, everybody. I'm so pleased to see so many participants tonight. So, here we go. I'm going to share my screen. When we were presented with potential topics for this talk, I kind of jumped on statistics. Not that I'm an expert at it by any means, but I have taken a few classes in recent years, and I thought that it would be timely, just as Dexter was describing, with research projects coming up and with many people taking board exams this time of year. So I tried to kind of tailor this biostats refresher to what our most practical needs would be as preceptors. So I came up with a theoretical PGY1 project based on one of our projects from last year, and everything relating to that is highlighted in yellow within the presentation. And then I have some questions that are geared towards board exam preparation, and everything that you see in blue in the slides relates to the board exams. So here we go. Here's my objectives. By the end of the presentation, you should be able to recall fundamental concepts in biostatistics. And please bear with me because the beginning, it starts off a little slow, but I think it's pretty important to just review all this foundational stuff, which is very basic, just so that when we get into more complex stuff, we have all our terminology straight. And then we're going to evaluate a statistical analysis plan for a PGY1 research project. It's a theoretical one based on one of our collaborative projects last year. And then by the end of the presentation, you should be able to accurately select correct answer items during multiple choice board certification exam relating to biostatistics. And I think probably, since I have reviewed for those tests fairly recently, a lot of this is going to sound familiar from those lectures for anybody who studied for these exams in recent years. I think that by the end of this presentation, you should be able to cover maybe 70 to 80% of the questions you'd see on those exams. I didn't cover everything, but most of it's in here. And then finally, I created a couple of very short video tutorials on how to perform some of our most common statistical tests within STATA. I did the students T and the chi-squared test. And this is what at UCSF, our PGY1s, this is the software they're using to run their statistical analysis. So here's the roadmap for today. We're just going to talk about variables and descriptive statistics. We'll try to get through this pretty quickly because I think this is familiar to most people. Then inferential statistics and hypothesis testing, which is probably a little less comfortable. Statistical tests, and I have a few slides on decision errors. It's telling me my internet connection is unstable, so if you can't hear me and you'd like me to repeat anything, just let me know in the chat box. So I'm going to start with variables. And there's two different kinds. There's discrete and continuous. And discrete is exactly as it sounds. It can only take on a finite or limited number of values within a given range. And discrete data can be broken down further to nominal and ordinal data. Nominal, like a name or a category, represents group data with no sense of rank. This is like yellow, red, blue, green, male, female, you had the disease or you didn't have the disease, you died or you didn't in the study. So just categorical. And ordinal data does have a magnitude of difference, but we don't know exactly what the magnitude of difference is. So there's no standard interval between groups. So the most common clinical example is the New York Heart Association functional class, where we know that NYHA 4 is worse than 2, but we don't know how much worse, and exactly how much worse is going to vary for each patient. And you couldn't really quantify it numerically, but you know that there is a matter of degree there in the severity. Trauma score is very similar, but with more numbers. And Likert scale, which you'll see a lot in surveys and literature, with 0 being strongly disagree and 5 being strongly agree. I don't really know with certainty what the difference between strongly agree and agree are, but we know that there's a ranked order. Alternatively, there's continuous variables, and these can take on any value within a given range. They can have infinitely many values. Degrees Celsius can be anywhere from -273 to infinity. Blood pressure, time, distance, these can all take on infinitely many values. Okay, so why is this important? Correctly identifying data type will be most important, most useful for, is it A, calculating variance and standard deviation, B, developing a null hypothesis, C, assessing study power, and D, selecting statistical tests. And the polling software I've used is Poll Everywhere. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but you just log onto the website or text this number and then you can join, and I will activate this question. Okay, I've got 9 responses, and the 9 people who answered got it right. This is most important for, 13 responses now. Now everybody has it right. 14 responses, 100% accurate. Correctly identifying data type will be most useful for selecting statistical tests, and that's why there's this emphasis on different variables. If you have continuous versus ordinal data, it limits which statistical tests you can use for your analysis. Okay, I think Poll Everywhere killed my computer for a second. For which of the following data sets would it be most appropriate to evaluate mean and standard deviation? Is it A, Chad's VAS scores for 90 anticoag clinic patients over 50 years old? B, head circumference measurements for 25 infants? C, New York Heart Association functional class for all patients admitted to UCSF Advanced Heart Failure Service in 2019? For D, gender of all patients seen for ERCP at Parnassus during the first quarter of 2020. All right, we have 14 responses so far, and they're all correct. Maybe I needed to come up with more difficult questions, but yes, head circumference is a continuous variable. Chad's VAST scores is technically ordinal data, even though there's a lot of points there, they're not continuous. New York Heart Association functional class is ordinal, as we covered in gender, is a binary variable. Next, okay, introduction to our study. You are precepting a PGY1 named Lucy. She's evaluating vanilla and lactose administration in the ICU. She's gathered patient baseline characteristic data, and before selecting statistical tests, she needs your help identifying a few data types for her variables. Now, if you're unable to read the fine print here, the variables are sex, male, female, Apache 2 score, BMI, body mass index, and MAP, mean arterial pressure. And then we have continuous, 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 continuous. Everything says A on the slide for some reason. Sex, nominal, Apache, ordinal, BMI, continuous, MAP, continuous. That's truly B, it's a sham A. C, sex, nominal, Apache, continuous, BMI, continuous, MAP, continuous. And finally, D, sex, ordinal, Apache, nominal, BMI, ordinal, and MAP, continuous. Okay, so this one's got a little more variety to it. So we're saying sex, nominal, Apache, ordinal, BMI, continuous, and MAP, continuous is the most popular one. And the second runner-up was nominal, continuous, continuous, continuous. And that's the red herring answer. Apache isn't quite continuous. It is ordinal data because it is a scoring system. Okay, so now that we got data types down, what types of statistics do we have? Descriptive and inferential. Descriptive really just summarizes data, and it can be done visually or numerically. And at its basic level, this is stuff you've been doing since grade school, such as drawing a scatter plot, calculating mean, median, and mode. So I'll try not to spend too much time on this, but it's important just to have it fresh in your mind when we get into the statistical tests. Versus inferential statistics is maybe a little less comfortable. This is where we're using a population sample to make inferences about a larger population. So it has many more limitations than descriptive statistics because you're using a smaller piece of a whole to make generalizations about the whole. And a major limitation is always determining whether that sample is representative. And we can talk a little more about that. But for inferential statistics, our methodology depends on the data we're using and the design of the trial. And we can use estimation or hypothesis testing, both of which are going to add value. So first is descriptive statistics. Everybody's familiar with scatter plots and histograms. These are visual ways of representing data. This is just a sample from Google, scatter plot, and you can see that quickly by looking at the two columns of data, temperature, and associated ice cream sales. You may not notice it just looking at the numbers, but a scatter plot paints a nice image that there seems to be a correlation here between increasing ice cream sales with increasing temperature. And then for the definitions, I've included the small data set, the ages of members of a household. So descriptive statistics include measures of spread and measures of central tendency. And measures of central tendency are exactly what they sound like. Where is the middle? And mean, as I'm sure everybody is aware, is the arithmetic average. So you add them all up, and 10, 10, 20, 40, 70. The sum divided by the number of values, 5, equals 30. So the mean of our data set is 30. And mean is going to be a better representation of central tendency for a data set that's continuous, parametric, normally distributed. And when I say normally distributed, I mean if you were to plot all the points on a scatter plot, you would see a bell-shaped curve. The big limitation with mean is that if you have one data point like way out on the side, an outlier, it's going to pull the mean along with it. And it may not be representative of your sample as a whole because the mean is very sensitive to outliers. Next is median. This is exactly that, just the middle point. And the midpoint when you've ranked all the values from lowest to highest, so here they're already ranked for you, you just select the one in the middle, and that's the median, 20. Median's a good option for continuous data, but it's also a great option for when we have ordinal data where we can't really use the mean. Where taking a mean might not make as much sense. So we talked about Chad's 2-VASC scoring, which is ordinal data. And we do know that if your Chad's VASC is 5, it's a higher stroke risk than if your Chad's VASC is 2. But how much worse, it's not really clear, and it's not increased by the same interval from each point increase on the whole Chad's VASC scale, because not all risk factors are equal. But we do know that there's an order to it. So taking a mean Chad's VASC score of a population, when you get a value like 3.5, it's a little nonsensical. You can do it, and sometimes people do, but if you're a purist, it's a little inappropriate, and what we want to do here is find the median. Because what is like a Likert scale rank of 3.5, like a hair above neutral, it's not very meaningful, whereas a median value would be much less difficult to interpret because a median value is going to be either 3 or 4 on that Likert scale. It's either neutral or agree. So for ordinal data, median is a great option, but it can be used for continuous data as well. And then mode, you always have to include mode. It's just the most commonly occurring value, not as useful as a measure of central tendency most of the time, but it is going to be useful if you want to highlight key values that are occurring more often. Data sets can be bimodal or trimodal. So you can use them to point things out, but you're not often going to present the mode as the most, as the sole measure of central tendency, I should say. And then it would be inappropriate to provide just the measure of central tendency alone. It needs to be accompanied by some value of data spread. So in addition to just the middle, we want to demonstrate how spread out it is. One thing we can do is calculate a range. That's just the minimum value and the maximum value, the difference between them. So here, the range is 70 minus 10, or 60 years. So with our measure of central tendency, we'd report the data spread measure along with it. And then range is probably the simplest of these. Another measure is the interquartile range. And the interquartile range is just that interval between the 75th and 25th percentile, which is the middle 50% of the data. So this is often presented alongside the median. And what you do to calculate it is, so here are data, we have an odd number of data points, so it's a little bit trickier. So the 25th percentile lies between 10 and 10, and the 75th between 40 and 70. So to calculate what that is, we just average 70 and 40 to get 55. The difference between them is the interquartile range. And last is the variance and standard deviation, probably the most informative measures of data spread. It's definitely the most pervasive in the literature, and it's a sum of the variability of individual variations of each data point. Also, something that they want you to know for these exams is that if something is normally distributed, you can expect 68% of values to lie within 1 standard deviation of the mean value, 95% within 2, and 99.7% to fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean for normally distributed data. So you wouldn't often have to calculate the variance, but here's how you would do it for a small data set like this. We calculated our mean value to be 30. So we take each value and find its difference from 30 and square it, sum that, and divide by n minus 1. The n minus 1 is a little funky. It's the degrees of freedom. It comes from a complicated theorem. I was going to try to explain it, but it probably would have been 10 additional slides to try to do that. So doing that here, we get 650 for the variance. It's not as meaningful as the square root of it, which is the standard deviation. And that value is 25.5. Okay, so before we move on to the next question, if anybody has any descriptive statistics questions, if they want to add it to the chat box. Is there anything in the chat box I might be missing it?
I don't see anything, Salem, so far.
Okay. All right. So Lucy, your PGY1 resident would like to use descriptive statistics to characterize the duration of vanilla and lactose therapy for each patient in her study. Unfortunately, there are a few major outlying data points, and the data distribution does not follow a normal distribution. Which of the following measures of central tendency and spread would best describe this type of data? Is it mean and standard deviation, mean and interquartile range, median and standard deviation, or median and interquartile range? And here's the abbreviated POL-EV version of the question. Cool. Okay, so most popular is median interquartile range, and that's absolutely right. Median standard deviation, that wouldn't be terrible. I think just because we don't have a normal distribution, it would be a little more challenging. A median and interquartile range, they kind of go together in my mind, but I wouldn't rule out median and standard deviation as an appropriate answer. Okay, so I've mentioned this bell curve, the normal distribution, and I drew one for you, and let's talk about it a little more. It's also known as the Gaussian curve, and there's other distributions too, but this is a common recurring one in sample distributions. There's like, it tends to show up a little more than it should. There's this theorem, the central limit theorem, that if you repeat samples of a population, they'll all resolve to the normal, whether or not the population has a normal distribution among itself. It's very strange. And then for a normal distribution, the mean is going to be essentially right there in the middle, plus or minus a little bit. And to assess for normality, which is important in selecting our tests, there's a few things we can do. We can visually inspect it and eyeball it and say, this curve looks roughly like a normal bell curve. And then second, we can compare the median and the mean, and for normally distributed data, these should align. If the median and the mean if they differ greatly, then it's probably not normally distributed data. And then finally, there's a formal assessment where a statistical test for normality, the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test statistic, and this calculates a value that shows, yes, this data approximates the normal distribution. And figuring this out is important because if we don't have a normal data spread, it limits which statistical tests we can use in our analysis. This is a different type of distribution. This is skew. So alternatively to normal, we can have skewed data sets. And this is a situation where some outliers, in this particular circumstance on the right-hand side, aren't conforming to the pattern set by the majority of the data points. And outliers are going to most affect the mean value and pull it to the right. So you can see the median and the mean differ quite a bit here. So for skewed non-normal data, the mean will just go in the direction of the skew. So this is termed right-sided or positive skew. For some reason, it was impossible for me to memorize that when I first learned this stuff. And then when it goes the other way, it's negative or left-sided skew. So just whichever side the mean is on. And then when the skew is really substantial, it can limit which tests we can use to compare data. That's all.
Hey, Salem, before we go to this question, there's a question from the chat. So Gina says, by how much would the mean and median have to be different for it not to be considered normally distributed, i.e. skewed? Is there a certain fraction that they would differ?
No, and I think that this is like, I don't know if there's an official answer to this question, but it's kind of like how much of a perfectionist are you, I think. And because we're using things like visual inspection of the data and comparing the mean and the median, but we don't really have a cutoff threshold, it seems to be a little bit more of an art than a science. I'm sure a statistician who is more familiar with Kolmogorov-Smirnov testing could give you a more official answer.
Thank you, Salem.
Okay, so Lucy collects ages of all the patients receiving the treatment. And this reveals a mean age of 55.2, median of 62, and mode of 62 years old. Which of the following best describes this data? Is it a normal distribution? Is it a distribution that's skewed to the left? Is it a binomial distribution or a distribution that's skewed to the right? Now, to be fair, this is an example of what we were just talking about. These numbers are very close, and with a large enough sample size, it might not be meaningful, but just to illustrate our point. Okay. Okay, so the most popular answer is skewed to the left. Second most popular is skewed to the right. Nobody chose Poisson distribution. That generally deals with larger populations. Binomial distribution, repeated measures. But skewed to the left is exactly right. And that's because the mean is smaller than the median. But is it that meaningful of a skew? It's hard for me to say. Okay, so next is inferential statistics and hypothesis testing. And this is probably a little more interesting. Thanks for sitting through the slog with me. So hypothesis testing this is what we do if our observed observations between two groups, if we want to determine if this is due to chance. So we first develop a null and alternative hypothesis. So we have to start with the null, which is like in the context of a clinical trial or a superiority trial, the null hypothesis is that there's no difference between a treatment group and a placebo group. Kind of think of the null hypothesis as nothing to see here, there's no difference. Okay, so Lucy finds a statistically significant difference in fungal infections between patients who received treatment, 1 out of 82 infected, and those who received usual care, 11 out of 149 infected, with an alpha value of 0.05. Which of the following statements is true regarding statistical significance? Is it A, the p-value is less than 0.05, B, the p-value reflects the magnitude of the difference, C, statistical significance is independent of alpha, and D, statistical significance cannot be determined? Whoa, okay. Yeah, everybody got this one right. Oh. Should have given people more time. Okay. The 7 people who answered, most of them got it right. The p-value was less than 0.05. Statistical significance can be determined, just the context of the question was a little weird. It was funny, I didn't give you the p-value. But yes, the p-value was less than 0.05. Okay, so when do we reject the null and accept statistical significance? So nothing to see here, no difference. We reject that concept. We set our significance level a priori before we even started. And that's something you're going to want to be seeing as you're evaluating literature. This helps to maintain the integrity of the study design. And this determines the level of acceptable error caused by a false positive. And we're going to talk a little bit more about decision errors and false positives and false negatives later. But the convention is that alpha is set to 5%. And it can be more or less stringent than that, depending on what level of error you're willing to accept, but 5% is very classic. So with the fungal infection example, where the treatment group had 1 infection out of 82, and the control group, 11 out of 149 infected. And we want to determine if those are significantly different. So the null hypothesis, indicated by this H0, is that the rate of fungal infections is equivalent. It's the same in the control group as in the treatment group. So that's effectively just saying there's no difference. Our alternate hypothesis is that maybe our new experimental group had a different fungal infection rate than the control. So then we have our significance level, and by convention we set that at 0.05, and this means we're willing to accept a false positive result only 5% of the time. So how does this play out? Let's go through it like step by step, because this is probably the most confusing topic of this presentation. We have sample data. We collect fungal infection data for all patients in the control group and all the patients receiving treatment. Then we evaluate the total number of fungal infections among the treatment group, and it's 1 out of 82, while usual care has a fungal infection rate of 11 out of 149. We use a statistical test, which will result in a critical value or test statistic or p-value. And these are all different values, and p-value is probably commonest to report, but they all kind of express the same thing. So we run our statistical test, and then we get an output. So our total is 1 out of 82 relative to 11 out of 149. And if the null hypothesis is true, that there's no difference, how likely is it that we would see this result experimentally? That's what your p-value is. So you get this p-value, which we calculate to be 0.04, big reveal, a 4% chance of seeing this result if the rate of fungal infections are truly equivalent between treatment and control groups, 1 out of 82 and 11 out of 149. So we set by convention, alpha is 5%, 4% is less than 5%, and we say, you know what? That's significant. That is a difference. It is unlikely that we would get this result, a fungal infection rate of 1 out of 82, if in fact there was no difference between groups, if this sample was the same as usual care. So let's say it again, these numbers look different. 11 out of 149, 1 out of 82. Is that truly different, or is it maybe just by chance we saw that? We run the test, we set alpha to 0.05 before everything, and under the assumption that there's no difference, what's the probability that we'd get this infection rate, 1 out of 82? Is that likely? It's unlikely, 4% chance. And that's sufficiently unlikely for us to say with confidence, yes, there's something to see here. There seems to be a difference in the rate of fungal infections between these groups. So with this result being 4%, less than 5%, we reject the null, and there's evidence to support our alternative hypothesis that, in fact, the experimental group was less likely to develop fungal infections.
Hey, Salem.
Yes.
Before you move on, there's a question on the last question from the group, and it says, since we didn't have the p-value, were we just assuming the p-value was less than 0.05 because it was stated that Lucy found statistical significance?
Yeah, that was probably an error in authorship. I didn't mean to be so subtle. I just meant, was there something, I stated that there was statistical significance, and to me that meant that the p-value was less than 0.05, but I probably should have included it in the question as well.
Great, thanks for clarifying.
Okay, so p-values, the concept of p-value I found to be a little slippery when I first learned about them. I still do. Small p-value doesn't indicate anything about the magnitude of the difference, although it's very hard when you see a very small p-value to not think that that's a more meaningful result than when you see a 4% p-value. Size of p-value has no correlation with clinical significance, of course. Statistics do not determine importance, they only provide a level of certainty. So there's no matter of degree here, you either crossed the threshold or you did not. And I alluded to decision errors in this false positive and false negative stuff earlier. Just to drill down on it, there are two types. Type 1 is represented by alpha. That's our probability of a type 1 error. And because like on these exams, for instance, you'll get a lot of questions about type 1 versus type 2 errors, and it's hard to keep them straight. I always think of type 1 error as being like the cardinal sin, like the worst error that you can commit. Rejecting the null hypothesis when you should not, when there's truly no difference, or a drug trial saying that your treatment is effective when it's no more effective than placebo. So alpha is the probability of this, and by convention is 5%. Type 2 error is represented by beta, and this is a false negative result, which, seems a little less offensive. Failing to reject the null hypothesis when you should, concluding there's no difference when one actually does exist. Okay, so which of the following most likely represents a type 2 error? A, negative HCG result for a 29-year-old female in labor. B, positive HCG result for an 85-year-old male patient with benign prostatic hyperplasia. Negative HIV result for patient with no significant past medical history. Or positive HIV result for a patient with a history of IV drug use. So type 2 error, remember, was the false negative, and the female actively in labor is definitely pregnant. So that is the most, like, everybody really got ahead of me on that one. Okay. Yeah, sorry for the small font size here. So Lucy has evaluated clinical outcomes for patients in both the treatment and control groups of her study using appropriate statistical tests. Which endpoints here are significantly different between groups? So we have variables on the left. The treatment group, treatment column is column 1, and then column 2 is usual care, and there's p-values provided here. Which of these would generally be considered to be significantly different between groups? I don't know why it says everything's A. I think it's when I converted from Google Slides to PowerPoint. Okay, so the most popular was change in chocolate dose, in-hospital mortality, and fungal infections. And if I look back at the table, change in chocolate dose, yep. In-hospital mortality, yep. So basically, you're just finding all of those which were less than 0.05. Well done. Okay, power and sample size. Power is 1 minus beta. Beta, and beta type detect a difference if it does exist versus the opposite of failing to find a difference when one does exist. Power is determined by alpha, beta, the effect size of whatever you're talking about, and also by variability within your data. And sometimes we have good numbers on those things, and sometimes we don't. And generally, effect size is the big unknown, and we're usually trying to get it from previous literature. So it's limited a little bit by what we know about what we're studying. But I think this is the hardest thing. There's a lot of questions every year in the DCR course, when the residents have to calculate their sample size about how to predict the effect size. And this year, the sample size calculator has gotten really decked out, and there's a lot more options to choose from. I encourage you to check it out, and I've linked it here. But so if a study doesn't meet power, it's effectively like saying a type 2 error is likely. So more likely than we'd want to accept. So if you have a small difference between your null hypothesis and your alternative hypothesis, then it's much more likely that you're going to have a possible type 2 error, because you would need a very large sample size to detect such a small difference most of the time. Now, in the event that you fail to meet power from the outset, but you do find a difference, it's a little less of a problem because you did enroll enough people. You did find that difference. The effect size was significant. There's definitely no type 2 error. However, that outcome is a little less likely. Okay, so just a little bit on confidence intervals. These are similar to p-value, but a little more informative. And I tried my hardest to draw straight lines for you, but I couldn't figure out how to do it on my iPad. These help determine significance of a finding. They're a way to describe like a point estimate within a study population. And when choosing between p-values and confidence intervals are a little nicer because they seem to give you a little bit more information. it gives you a little bit more of an idea about a magnitude and importance. Whereas we said p-values are like, yep, you cross the threshold, that result is significant. It is unlikely that that result would occur by chance, but it tells you very little else. Most commonly, correlating with a 5% p-value is a 95% confidence interval in medical literature, but you can have a 99% confidence interval, a 90% confidence interval is common as well. And the larger the interval, the greater the variability, or the less confident you can feel about the information contained therein. So you're like, oh, the confidence interval contains the true value and it's in there somewhere, but where is it? So you can see this 99% confidence interval is much wider and contains many more of these pink values than the 95% confidence interval. A 100% confidence interval would be infinitely wide. And then everybody wants you to know how to interpret confidence intervals. In the setting of any ratio data, like odds ratio, hazard ratio, risk ratio, if the confidence interval does not include 1, it is statistically significant. If it includes 1, it's not significantly different. And why is that the case? Because a ratio is a simple division problem. So x divided by x, or 2.5738 divided by 2.5738. And what that is implying is that the two groups have an equivalence somewhere. So if in your confidence interval 1 is in there, it means potentially that your treatment and your control groups could have the same value and therefore no difference. So in the setting of ratio or any division type data, if 1 is included, there's no difference. For continuous variables, we're looking at 0. If it does not include 0, it is statistically significant. And if the confidence interval includes 0, it is not statistically significant. Because in the setting of continuous data, let's just say we're comparing times between two groups. If 0 falls in there, the difference between them is 0 time, indicating that they're potentially the same, or that the null hypothesis is true and there's no difference between groups. So ratios, you don't want to see 1. Continuous values, you don't want to see 0. And then, well, 99 and 90% confidence intervals sometimes are reported. The most common is 95. 99 will always be wider. And it's just a trade-off between precision and accuracy. So 95 is like a good bargaining point right in the middle. So in Lucy's adjusted analysis, she calculated odds ratios with 95% confidence intervals for several outcomes in her study, comparing the treatment and usual care groups. Which of these would generally be accepted as significantly different between groups? Here we go. Is it blood pressure response, in-hospital mortality, composite thromboembolic events, or none of these? None of the above wins. My questions are too easy. Yep, because all of these, this is ratio data, and we're looking for it to cross 1. These all cross 1. The next question is going to be a little harder. Among patients treated, 84% died in the hospital, while only 67% of those in the usual care arm died in the hospital. Which of the following is a correct interpretation of Lucy's odds ratio data in regards to this finding? Is it A? So you can see in hospital mortality, the odds ratio is 2.37 with a range of 0.93 to 6. Is it A, 95% of vanilla cream treated patients died at a rate 0.93 to 6 times higher than usual care? B, 95% of all similar samples of patients will have odds ratios for in-hospital mortality ranging 0.93 to 6 for vanilla cream? Or C, we are 95% sure that the odds ratio for death for vanilla cream treated patients as compared to usual care is between 93 and 6x. Yeah, and this is just a formal definition of confidence interval. So a confidence interval has to do with certainty. So the 95% sure is the dead giveaway here. We're 95% sure that the odds ratio for death for vanilla cream treated patients as compared to usual care is between 0.93, and 6 times. And because it crosses 1, it is unfortunately not significant. Last is statistical tests. And there's quite a few of these, and it's a bunch of name recognition, mostly, unfortunately. But I did go through and run a couple of them to demonstrate. I'm not sure if the audio is going to come through on a YouTube video on this presentation. I really hope it does. But how do you select them? How do you choose which is right? How do you know which one's best? And this depends on a few things. We already know that it depends on the data type, whether you have normally distributed data or not. The study design, how many groups are there in your study? Are there more than 2 groups? Are the data paired versus unpaired, and are there confounders? All of these are going to indicate different statistical tests. So we can go through each of them quickly. The paired versus unpaired is pretty intuitive. Paired just means that estimates from one sample are compared with estimates from a matched sample. And very often it's going to be the same person. So subjects acting as their own controls, the same person before and after a given intervention. It's great because it's a great financial decision, but it also eliminates the variability between patients because you are yourself. So there's less variability. And versus unpaired, they're divided into separate groups for comparison, which is more typical in major drug trials. But we'll use different statistical tests depending on whether data are paired or unpaired. Confounding variables are, they're difficult. There are variables that may affect the outcome of interest, and it's difficult to separate them from other things. The problem is we don't always know about these. If we do know, there's usually control measures we can put into place. We can sample and randomize patients differently, and statistically we can adjust as well. The issue, though, is sometimes we don't know what the confounders are before we begin, and an unforeseen confounder or a lurking variable can really affect the data. So that is a challenge. And I've included here just an example of several independent variables affecting the dependent variable of outcome. The one-tailed tests are really only going to be appropriate if you can say with confidence that a difference is going to go in one direction, or you only care if it's going to go in one direction. More common is to use a two-tailed, whereas where the difference can go either way between your hypothesis groups. And it could be better or worse. Students T is probably one of the most common tests we use. It's for means of 2 samples, and because it's means, you know that it's going to be continuous data, so you wouldn't use a student's T test for ordinal data. And then kind of the next level up from it is ANOVA, the analysis of variance. The only difference between students T and analysis. So if you have drug A, drug B, drug A and B, placebo group, then you'd use an ANOVA test. And it's similar to a T test, except if you were to run T tests between multiple groups like that, you'd compound your risk of error. Whereas with ANOVA, you help to mitigate that, though it's very similar in nature to running multiple T tests. And then what it does is it gives you this output that tells you there's a difference, but it doesn't tell you if it's between groups 1 and 2, groups 2 and 3, groups 1 and 3, groups 1 and 4, who knows? So then you need to use post hoc testing if you're interested in figuring that out. I've listed a few of those tests: Tukey, Bonferroni, Fisher's least squares, and these kind of just differ in whether they're more or less conservative in the way they account for error, but are a little bit beyond what we're talking about today. So students T, then when we exceed those 2 groups, it's ANOVA. And then here, fingers crossed that my audio will play in my YouTube video, but I created a tutorial on how to perform a t-test using sample data within STATA, the software that all our PGY1 residents have. I like it for its simplicity. Hopefully this works. Are you just seeing PowerPoint still, or are you seeing YouTube on my on the screen?
Right now, we just see PowerPoint, Salem.
Okay, I think I have to change the screen share. Can you hear the audio?
I hear murmurs of audio.
It's just murmurs.
Yeah. Now I see YouTube.
Yes, but can you hear the YouTube?
Not yet.
Okay, that's unfortunate. So I'm pulling up a sample data set in STATA. I'm describing how to do that. I've included the links in the slides here so that you can review these if you want to after the presentation. But this is probably the most useful part of this presentation. So this is a sample data set within STATA, and it's kind of set up like in Excel here where different demographic data are in different columns, and then each number represents a different patient. A lot of the REDCap output is going to output exactly like this format within STATA. So then this is just blood pressure before and blood pressure after some intervention. Before we do that, we can visualize the data, the graphic. So now I'm just creating a histogram of the data so you can kind of see the two sets that you're comparing. So the two groups are males and females, and it's showing you the blood pressure before variable. These are charts of blood pressure frequencies, the height of each bar of histogram of blood pressure for both males on the left, males on the right. And they look kind of similar, but we can use a t-test to determine formally. So you can tell that these distributions are similar, but the t-test will formally tell us how similar they are. Classical test hypotheses t-test. So after selecting the variable, you want to compare two sample means using groups. We're looking at the variable blood pressure before. Blood pressure before was the variable we plotted. And this is the output. This shows summary stats. It's a little hard to read at first, but this shows you the mean for each group, males and females, standard error and standard deviation. The difference in blood pressure overall is 5.6 millimeters. The difference between the means is here. The null hypothesis is that the blood pressure does not differ. So now the null hypothesis is that the blood pressure doesn't differ, but then we see a difference in the means of 5.6. So the t-tests are down here at the bottom. The one-taileds are on the left and right, and in the center is the two-tailed t-test, which is most often what we're going to be most interested in. And you can see the p-value, 0.0062, is very small. So the null hypothesis that these blood pressure values are equivalent, 153 and 159, is very unlikely. These all represent the one-tailed and two-tailed t-test, respectively. The one in the middle is what we're most often interested in. That's the one that detects whether or not there is. The null is equal to 0, and the alternative is that not equal to 0. And the probability of seeing this result of the difference of 5.6 with them being really equal is very low. The p-value here . So the requirements for t-test and, am I sharing PowerPoint now?
No, I just see your video.
Oh, great.
Now I see
PowerPoint? Okay. The requirements for t-test are that data are approximately normal and continuous, and that variance within groups is approximately equal. These are going to have more power than their non-parametric analogs, which don't have these same requirements. Non-parametric tests we can use for continuous data that don't meet all these parametric requirements, and we can use them for ordinal data as well. Then here's a list of the non-parametric versions of these same tests. So the t-test has analogs Wilcoxon rank sum and Mann-Whitney U. How this came to be that they had two different names is that these guys, Mann-Whitney and Wilcoxon, came to the same statistical conclusions at the same time in different parts of the world. And so there's two different names, but the methodology is the same. Kruskal-Wallis, or one-way ANOVA, is the non-parametric ANOVA. And then for paired samples, there's Wilcoxon signed rank, not to be confused with Wilcoxon rank sum. And then the Friedman ANOVA for paired multiple group data. More common for nominal data is the chi-squared. And this compares expected and observed observations between two groups. Fisher's exact is like a close cousin of the chi-square, where you have very few observations in some. And all of these tests can be run within STATA. McNamara is when you have paired and nominal data. I'm not going to try to go through my chi-square tutorial video. I made it just for this presentation, so I really encourage you to go back to the slides afterwards and check it out. But that was way too clunky. Sorry, Zoom. Okay, so patients seen in the UCSF bariatric preoperative clinic by a pharmacist were asked to rate their satisfaction on a scale of 0 to 5, with 0 being very dissatisfied and 5 being extremely satisfied. This group will be compared to those not seen by a pharmacist. Which of the following statistical tests will be most appropriate for comparing the data? Is it ANOVA, Mann-Whitney U, chi-squared, or the McNamara test? Okay, we have two responses, and it's chi-squared. Oh, another country heard from, Mann-Whitney U. Yes, and Mann-Whitney U is what I was thinking would be the most appropriate test, because we have multiple categories for ranking, and there is a matter of degree to it, but it's not parametric. So you can't use our continuous students t-test. Chi-squared, I didn't think would be as appropriate because it's not just nominal data. There is an order to it. It's the Likert scale. And then since I have 0 minutes left, just a couple of things on correlation and regression. This is like the #1 question from our residents is about different kinds of regression. They want to assess for confounders, and they can do this through regression. But correlation just shows the strength of association between variables without any causal relationship. And it ranges with an R from -1 to 1, which you might remember from Algebra 2 in high school. It's very similar to the y equals mx plus b. Spearman rank is the non-parametric version. So say you have logarithmically distributed data, you just rank the data points from 1 to 10, for instance. And then the Spearman will find the correlation without so much attention to the degree of difference between the data points. I included an example of a spurious correlation. The divorce rate in Maine correlates over time with margarine consumption, probably not related variables, but they both decreased over time. And then regression examines how much each dependent variable influences an outcome. I included an example here of hair length, serum creatinine, and BMI, all determining a given outcome with different levels of weight for each variable. So in summary, the measures of data spread and central tendency and other factors help to select statistical tests. And then common and useful statistical tests can be performed using STATA. for people who are not experts at statistics like myself. But it can be done pretty easily, and it's available to all our PGY1 residents here at UCSF. This is reading like an advertisement, kind of, sorry about that. Board certification exam questions relating to biostatistics mainly involve terminology and very little math. And I don't really have much time for questions, but if you want to email them to me or just stop me on the street and say hi, I'd be happy with that. Here are my references, and I'll turn it back over to Dexter.
So Salem, unless you have other time commitment, we can take a couple minutes for questions if people have them. Just feel free to unmute yourself, or if you're not at a place where you can talk, just put it in the chat and I can mediate that as long as Salem's okay with it.
Sounds good.
So we'll give everybody a couple minutes. I was talking with Sue, who is our next presenter, as we go through these, and she is willing to start earlier. So if everyone is okay with it, we'll probably just take 10 minutes after we finish up with questions here from Salem and reconvene maybe about 6:20 instead of the original 6:30 time. And it looks like there are a lot of praise for you, Salem, for doing this.
I like it. Keep it coming. It's easier than questions.
I would agree. I think you did a great job. These YouTube videos are definitely helpful from using them as a resident. So I think that having a couple more added to the repertoire is wonderful. So thanks for putting this together, Salem, and thanks for refreshing us all on these very important statistical topics.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. So now we'll take a short break and reconvene around 6:20. So I'll see everyone back then. Yes, I can see your slides. I can hear you fine.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging out and sticking with us for another hour this evening. I know for those who this is falling in our after work hours, how precious this time is. So really, thank you so much, and thank you for being so dedicated to preceptor development. Dexter, while I'm sharing my slides, I just can't see the chat box, so if you don't mind, I might be doing this wrong, so just let me know and then maybe help facilitate that piece.
Yes, I will read all questions to you at a stopping point on the slide.
Thank you, appreciate it. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about structuring an effective learning experience. The learning objectives are here for you to review, and they very much mirror the standard learning objectives of our preceptor development CEs. So before we jump in, I first wanted to preface, similar to Salem, that I by no means am the expert in this realm, and I too I consider myself to be a fairly new preceptor still, and so I'm still learning a lot. And a lot of the tools and sort of examples that I'm providing tonight are by no means created from scratch. A lot of these things have been very well vetted from our predecessors, a lot of whom are actually on this call tonight. So it's really been a lot of trial and error. And I'm hoping that tonight this can be more of an open forum. And really, it's pretty rare for our group to kind of get together like this in one common space at the same time. So I'm really hoping we can all share ideas with each other and really just use this as a nice opportunity for discussion. So just to begin, I was hoping to get a little bit of a better sense of everyone's current practice sites. So I think popped up on your screen there are a couple of polling questions. So the first question is just kind of describing what your practice site is as a preceptor and a pharmacist. And if you select other, then please do kind of describe in the chat box more specifics. The second question here is sort of describing your learner population. And then for preceptor, sort of just describing, do you work in a primarily team-based approach or group of preceptors, or are you usually really the only preceptor overseeing all of your learners? And I'll give everyone just a minute to kind of complete those.
I'll publish the results at the end, Sue. We have about 21 or 50% of people who have voted so far.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end voting and publish those results. So you should be able to see the results on your screen.
Great, thank you. So it does look like a great majority here are preceptors in an acute care setting, but we have a really great representation from other sites, including AmCare, administration, and even our operations. It looks like, as sort of I anticipated, that all of us primarily precept all layers of learners, which is really excellent. So I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And interesting, it does look like a great majority of us are actually team-based preceptors, which is also really great because a lot of the things that we'll talk about today will sort of highlight the challenges and the certainly benefits of team-based approaches to preceptorship. Great, thank you. The second question I have, and you'll sort of pick up on a theme moving forward, but this is a very broad question, and that was intended to be so. And please feel free to type things into the chat box. I think we have a relatively reasonable group of participants here, so if you'd like to just chime in, then please do so as well. But as of today, when thinking about your current learning experience, what are some challenges that you're facing? And that, again, could mean anything, just to get a sense of what everyone is finding to be of challenge in today's climate.
Feel free to unmute yourselves and chime in. We have some responses coming into the chat. I'll read those as they come. Not enough time.
Oh yeah, I hear you on that one. So time constraints is huge, and we'll definitely talk about that this evening.
Pressure to teach the different types of learners, even though your style is one way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That is one that I currently personally also struggle with a bit, is, really trying to understand and engage every learner's style. But again, we often have multiple layers of learners on at one time. So how do we, really adapt our own teaching styles to suit each learner, and is that really even feasible? So I think that's an excellent point you bring up, Rebecca.
We have a comment that says the need to get things done in a timely manner for patient care, but also give space for the learner to practice those skills. Example, discharge counseling.
Yes, absolutely. I know that clocking in and out, and I'll touch on this again too, has presented some unprecedented challenges for us. And so how do we get our duties done in an 8-hour day and do it effectively and safely, but while still offering those opportunities to our learners, and not stay, an hour or two after the clock is out. So I very much echo that sentiment as well.
We have multiple comments about precepting remotely and authentically via Zoom.
Yes, absolutely. I think all of us on this call actually can really concur and empathize with that piece. And again, based on our practice sites, I think some of us are perhaps facing more challenges because we may be practicing a little bit more so remotely. And so how do we engage our learners and keep them engaged while never actually having a lot of face-to-face time with them? So certainly, this is a unique challenge. And just to, let you all know, I don't have the answers to these questions. We're just going to talk about them, and hopefully together it'll be a nice opportunity for us to kind of just brainstorm and just a platform for us to empathize with one another as well. If it's okay, I think I'll move forward, Dexter. Okay, great. Thank you all so much for your comments. It's really exciting to hear some of these. So just to offer a little bit of background, this is just an example of my current practice site. So I am one of the preceptors for the adult critical care rotation. We currently have 6 adult intensive care units at Parnassus. We are a team of 14 preceptors. We have, at minimum, 2 PGY2 residents with us throughout the year, and occasionally we'll have PGY2 residents of other specialties and even other sites join us. This year, of our 13 PGY1 residents, we have 10 residents who rotate with us throughout the year. We have a number of APPE students, and then as well as IPPE students who join us longitudinally. So as you can see, and I'm sure this is mirrored in many of your practices as well, we have a really dynamic group of learners and preceptors, and additionally, we have a really dynamic set of learning sites across our ICUs. So just to highlight some of the things that you all have already brought up, so I'm happy to hear that it seems like a lot of us can really find some common ground, is why this topic and why today. And I think that because by no means, again, am I an expert, but the hope here is really just to learn from each other and using it as an opportunity to reflect on the structures of our own learning experiences and identify opportunities for optimization or even change. So it's not a new dilemma at all for those of us who have worked, especially in our department for some time, that we face multiple, at times, very conflicting responsibilities. And this is really on a day-to-day basis. Particularly here, I think pharmacists are really involved in countless initiatives, which is really wonderful. But teaching is really heavily integrated into our core practice. So we oversee QI projects, oversee or even conduct our own research projects. We are a hybrid model, so we are responsible for order verification and even operational tasks throughout the day. As noted before, many of you all are heavily involved in transitions of care and providing safe discharges for many of your patients. And all of this is, somehow balanced with teaching multiple different layers of learners. And this is all happening in the setting of a very continuous expansion of all of our training programs. So not just our PGY1 programs, but all of our PGY2 programs. Even the curriculum from the school side has changed drastically, which introduces, new sets of challenges from precepting our students' perspective. So the question here is then, how do we optimize efficiency and organization while still ensuring a high quality learning experience and still meet the needs of patient care and all of those non-patient care responsibilities that we are so heavily involved in? So that's kind of the big question for this evening. So I'm going to pause here again, and we'll take a few minutes, and feel free again to use the chat function or just kind of chime in. But when you are thinking about the structure of a learning experience, what are some things that you consider to be important? And one thing I did want to note I want to differentiate is when we talk about the structure of a learning experience, I'm not so focused on the actual content, meaning this is a little bit different from writing or creating a brand new learning experience or a syllabus.
I'll once again let you know when responses start coming in on the chat.
Yeah.
So can you give us an example of what you would consider? So just to give us a...
I recognize this is confusing. So when I think about the structure of a learning experience, I'm more so thinking about framework, which is I'll get into in just a moment. So things you think about, how many preceptors are there? And of those preceptors, how many are actually going to be working clinically during this rotation? How do I schedule someone who's, for a midpoint evaluation, who's actually been on with this learner for long enough to speak to these skill sets? Where am I going to find workspace? Things kind of like that I'm thinking of in terms of the structure of a learning experience. So how am I going to execute all of these activities that I've defined as needed to reach, these standard learning objectives that are outlined in the, let's say the learning experience description or syllabus.
So some things that are popping up, how the student learns best, how I teach best, and how to best merge the two.
Yeah, absolutely. So teaching style and learning style, how do we come to a middle ground? That is huge. I absolutely agree. I think that's an ongoing kind of question we all have for ourselves when we think about how do we want to facilitate a learning experience.
A couple other things you already touched on: how to manage different preceptors and how to introduce a learner to the team. It's very challenging given the remote learning climate.
Yeah, absolutely. Not all of us are actually able to participate in, I know, Zoom rounds or virtual rounds. So how do we facilitate our learner developing rapport with the team that they're going to work with for the next, 4 to 5 weeks? Those are all excellent points.
Learning flexibility was mentioned as well, and ensuring similar opportunities across learning experience. For example, participating on rounds, going to radiology, journal club, etc.
Yeah, and I think that last one really hits an important point that I will emphasize as well, and that is standardization. How do we offer standardization for a learning experience so that every learner who rotates through, let's say, heart-lung transplant or through my ambulatory care clinic gets to see the same things that are really fruitful for them?
And I think the last one before we move on was how to manage learners interested in my practice, i.e. Hospital or adult med versus community or peds. And I think just a clarification and something that I would add to that is how do you manage learners who are not interested in your practice as well?
Yes, absolutely. And again, I think that's really challenging, right? Because as much as I've just emphasized standardization, that I want every learner to see the same thing that I think would be important for their learning experience, if I have someone who has zero interest in critical care and it's just kind of along for the ride, how should I adapt this learning experience? Should I adapt the learning experience? And so we'll kind of touch upon that during our last towards the end when we talk about setting goals and clear expectations. So thank you all for your comments. I think all of us it seems like a lot of us kind of share a lot of similar thoughts and are facing some similar challenges, which is really great. Good for discussion's sake. So when I was sort of brainstorming and thinking about the structural components, or like I noted, the framework for a learning experience, I really thought about the question that was posed earlier is how can we optimize efficiency in organization? And how do we ensure a learning experience that facilitates the execution of those learning activities that we've defined to be really essential in working towards the goals and objectives of the rotation? So that's really what I'll be focusing on today. And so again, everyone, I think from every person's preceptor's learning experience, your pillars could look very different. And again, there's no right or wrong here. These are just the 4 pillars that I thought were important to me when I was thinking about the framework of a learning experience. And again, with standardization as the foundation here. So we will start off with talking about orientation. So before we think about orientation or onboarding a new learner, let's say we have a new learner that is starting with us in a week or so, what are some items that you like to include or you find is important to include when orienting or onboarding a new learner to your site?
We really like to focus on the medical team structure so that the resident knows who to contact and who they're going to be rounding with, because it kind of requires a diagram. It's that complicated. And that kind of gets, and then who to be paging, like who are new transplants, who are old transplants. Those help a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. 100% agree. Sometimes that we underestimate how important it is to recognize who should I be talking to, like what team is oversees this. I actually just had this conversation with one of our residents today, who gave me some feedback that like, hey, I find the clinical structure of all these teams really confusing, and I'm finding it actually be a bit of a hindrance in me being able to effectively get my interventions communicated. So I think you've brought up a really important point, Rebecca.
There's a comment in the chat, how many patients to start off with and how many they should end up following by the end of the rotation as a goal, and how to work up a patient, especially for the first acute care rotation.
Yes, absolutely. Let's start with the basics. Some of our learners are so new to acute care or our type of learning experience that, maybe they've never even seen a patient before face to face, really starting from from a strong foundation is really critical for their progress moving forward.
Also, the learner's previous experiences related to the current rotation to help establish a baseline.
Yes, absolutely echo that. And we'll actually talk a little bit about an example of a tool that we use to get to know our learners a little bit before they start with us on day one.
There's comments about an orientation checklist, like what to do when you show up to the site, how to format all your progress notes and interventions, which dot phrases to use, and how to choose the appropriate context based on your site.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are really important points. Again, because I'm actually going to be talking about some of these points just to illustrate that, you know, what I'll be talking about in the tools in the next couple of slides, this is nothing new. I didn't create this from scratch. These are all great tools that you all as more seasoned preceptors have really developed over the years, and we've just kind of adopted them and continue to refine them.
And then the last are just multiple iterations of modeling for learners.
Yes, absolutely. I think that especially day one, and maybe even just the first, you know, initial phases of your rotation, the modeling piece is so hugely important and often sometimes gets missed. And that's, I think, sometimes how learners get led a little bit astray early in their rotation. So thank you for that. Okay, thank you all so much. So again, questions that I'll pose is, you know, when you're orienting, whether it's before you provide orientation to a learner or as you are providing orientation to your learner, what do you find that has presented some challenges to you? And again, select all that apply. If there are, I'm sure there's others that haven't been captured here, so please feel free to provide more specific examples in the chat box.
And again, this is the poll that's running. I'll give it a little time and then I'll publish the results with everyone.
Great, thank you.
Coming up on 45 seconds, at which point I will stop and share.
Okay, so it looks like a great majority of us find that scheduling learning activities can be really challenging, and I'm sure that can be for a number of reasons. So finding adequate workspace, it sounds like all of us kind of are sharing the pain of finding, you know, safely distanced workspaces. I hear you on that one. Clocking in and out, again, a new challenge that I don't think was really, we could have anticipated from our standpoint. So that is hugely something that's been difficult to balance. A huge majority of us find balancing orientation with patient care priorities is really hard. And I absolutely agree, because orientation is really time consuming. So we'll kind of talk about how to maybe mitigate some of those things. And it does look like everyone kind of across the board can empathize with some of the things noted here. So thank you all. Okay, so when thinking about a learning experience orientation, I wanted us to keep, I think, a couple of things in mind in terms of our goals for orientation. So I think of it as starting off on the right foot and really setting up your learners for success. So one of the goals I've identified is to optimize standardization. Is every learner being set up for success every time? It's so easy to miss things if we don't have a standard approach to how we introduce our learners to our rotation. Learner introduction, so as someone noted before, you know, really getting to know our learners allows us as preceptors to have some early insight into their learning styles. You know, how can we think about teaching adaptation? Quite honestly, sometimes as a preceptor, it gives me a little bit of time for mental prep, like, oh boy, like I've got, you know, 2 very green learners starting with me on Monday, like let me prepare myself a little bit. And again, really emphasizing how we can maximize efficiency. As noted before, we have a number of different responsibilities in a day. orientation is time consuming, and it can take really, it could, really suck up our entire day. So how can we sort of utilize different tools to ensure that some of it can be actually taken off our plate, and really give it provided for the learner still in a standard approach. So we'll talk about all of these things. So for me and for our teaching group, orientation actually starts before day one. So we utilize a standard email template that encompasses all of the pertinent materials that every new learner must review and complete prior to their first day with us. And so included in this rotation prep material, we provide resources to give new learners kind of a crash course in basics and foundations in critical care medicine. A lot of these resources, again, were introduced and provided from preceptors in our group from many years ago, and they're just really helpful, so we've continued to provide them for our learners today. We ask every new learner to review our introduction checklist, and this covers everything from day one expectations, unit structure, apex setup, which is really awesome because on day one, every learner shows up, at 8 a.m. and they already have all the pertinent tabs that we find to be helpful for patient workup. If someone is in the 11 ICU, they already have a patient list for 11 ICU. Oftentimes they already have it printed. So, they're kind of ready to just hit the ground running. And we've even provided some examples of what they could do from like a Volt login standpoint and things like that. So in just a moment, I'll kind of share with you what that extensive learner checklist looks like. So this is not to say, though, that these materials replace face-to-face orientation with a preceptor, because I still think that is really valuable and important. This is simply to decrease the burden of like housekeeping items, if you will, that can be really time consuming to complete in just one day. Other things that we include in here are shared resources. So this houses all of the readings, guidelines, or other resources that a learner will need access to throughout to complete all of our required learning activities. And then most importantly is learner introduction. So let me see. I have it here. So this is actually the student and resident information sheet that we require every learner to complete and send back to us a couple of days before their first day with us. So we take upon the onus as preceptors to review this prior to meeting our learner on the first day. And I found that this actually really helps to kind of set the tone for day one. And it just gives us a better idea of who we're going to be working with for the next 4 to 5 weeks. I've also found that in our, so you can see sort of, we're just getting to know the background of the learner themselves. So, where have you rotated before? What are your career goals? What have you identified so far as some strengths and weaknesses? And then lastly, we ask them, is there anything else that you want us to know? And this last question can often be really insightful in terms of being a little bit more cognizant of any personal things that our learners want us to be aware of, or even just some cultural things. So I find that this is really helpful for us. And then lastly, I think, and truly most important, but sometimes forgotten, is who, what, and where. So who are you going to be meeting? Where do you want us to meet you? And then at what time? So this becomes really important. And I'm just going to pause here to share very briefly with you all. Our learner onboarding checklist. So as you can see, it's pretty extensive, and this is intentional. Oops, sorry, this one is for the preceptors, which we'll talk about in just a moment. We'll see. Sorry, why don't we just move on? I think I have the learner onboarding checklist for the preceptor shared here, but we have an example of the ones for our learners that I don't have pulled up. So just for the sake of time, we'll move on. Okay, so we have a very extensive checklist for our learners that the expectation is that they've reviewed it before day one, and that they have it on hand with them as our preceptors have our own version and are going through it with them as well on day one. And this is really just in the hopes that together with the two, with all the parties involved, nothing falls through the cracks and we cover all of our bases.
Hey, Sue.
Yes.
We're still seeing the preceptor checklist rather than your slides.
Oh yeah, I think that's my slide. Yeah, my slide.
It looks like the Google Drive.
Okay, sorry. Success?
Yes, success.
Thank you. So the hope is, again, collectively, we don't miss anything. So you can see here, some of it's kind of basic, print the list for the learner so they can follow along with you on their first day. Let's get your calendar set up. For those of, who've never seen a real patient before, let's do a little bit of show and tell and other resources. And it's really just to provide the preceptors some references so that they don't forget. Again, I think what's really important and why we find that these types of checklists are very effective is, again, we have a big team of preceptors. So any preceptor might be orienting a new learner at any point. And so this offers a very standardized approach and ensures that, again, even with such a big team of rotating preceptors, every learner sees the same orientation every time. Any questions before I move forward? Sorry about the back and forth. Okay, so all of the materials and resources we've reviewed thus far lives in a cloud-based platform. And this is really so, again, that all learners and preceptors have access. We as a group continue to kind of explore opportunities to take advantage of other existing productivity tools and maximize how efficient we can be. So other examples certainly of cloud-based platforms could be UCSF has access to Box, which has been really helpful. I know a lot of people use Dropbox. I think Office 365 has their own resources. Does anyone else by any chance have other platforms that they like to use in terms of housing, rotation, or learning experience related documents? I think I've hit sort of the big ones. Okay, so in terms of shared resources, we have a shared rotation calendar, which I'll talk about in much more detail in just a moment. And then we have, it houses all of our required topic discussions, associated readings, and references. So everything is really just in one home, which should be easy access for all of our learners when preparing. We also keep a number of living documents. So the reason I really like having some of these living documents is that they're really good opportunities to keep us as preceptors accountable. How many of us have assigned, let's say, DI questions, several DI questions maybe to a learner, and then later forget that you assigned them and we don't ever review them? Or you assign a ton of DI questions and then the next day it's a brand new preceptor and they have no knowledge that these were assigned. I know I am guilty of that and actually was just guilty of that today. So this, we actually ask all of our learners to create their own DI questions and keep them in our shared Google Drive so that as a preceptor, we can always have access to what they were asked before and what questions have still yet to be reviewed with their preceptor. Okay, great. So we're going to move on to our next piece, but were there any questions before I move on?
So I have a question. How long did it take you to upfront do all this work? And then did it save you, did you feel like you saved a lot of time, like as you onboard new residents each time? And then do you try to update all this material annually or after each resident?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Rebecca. So again, I have to say the really time-consuming, early work of this was done by my predecessors, many of whom are on this call. So Mandy and Fanny and Noelle, the earlier group of preceptors for our ICU team spent a lot of time building this. So I imagine it was pretty time consuming up front, but I have to say myself and again, some of the newer ICU preceptors are certainly like reaping the benefits of it, because I have to say it tremendously cuts down on the time you're spending going through a lot of orientation items on your first day with them. Really, a lot of the upfront work is expected for the learners to do on their own. So, even things like walking them through Apex, how do you set up a tab? What do I find useful when I'm reviewing, a brand new lung transplant patient? Those things are already established for them. So the next piece is really just the modeling and maybe just making some refinements there. So I do think that if you have, time to invest in this, I would highly recommend it, because I think, over time, it's hugely beneficial. And then in terms of how often we go back and reassess, it's kind of an ongoing process. So a lot of times, especially for the onboarding checklist, as things change, new conference schedules changed, or how we ask our residents to update their calendars, all of that continues to change. So it's an ongoing process. And it's, again, a living document. So I just we make changes as we go and just note the most recent versions. Our team has pretty frequent meetings and sync ups. So those are usually times that someone might address, hey, I was hoping we can make a little bit of modification based on my last and most recent orientation experience, and we kind of just make those changes live time.
There's one comment before we move on that I think is helpful. Says we often enlist residents to help out with these materials. One idea is to combat the time required to create them.
Yeah, absolutely. If I'm understanding that comment right, maybe asking residents or learners who've had our rotation before to continue to help us build it. So maybe even make some modifications to the checklist. What do we want to be covered? What can we take out? Maybe this is just too much or it's outdated. I absolutely agree with you. And I think we solicit a lot of feedback, hopefully by the end of every rotation. And oftentimes our returning PGY2 residents are also provide a lot of insightful feedback about, what maybe seems a little bit outdated and we can consider modifying. Great, excellent. Any other questions or comments before moving forward? All righty. So the next pillar, I guess, if you will, is setting goals and expectations, which I know is kind of a huge umbrella term, but I am focusing on this in the realm of the framework of the learning experience. And so why is establishing goals and expectations so important? And I think of it as just being really simple, that I am not a mind reader and neither are any of you all. So there's no way we can infer from each other anything in terms of each other's goals and our expectations for a learning experience. So this is hugely important. So in terms of approaching setting goals and expectations, an acronym that I know many people utilize in terms of approaching this is the SMART acronym. So be specific with your goals and your expectations. Again, none of us are mind readers, and goals and expectations are not really ones to be inferred from each other. As much as possible, we should be clear and explicit in terms of communicating them. Are these goals measurable? And if so, how will we measure them? And really defining that is really important. Are they achievable and are they realistic for the time period that we have, for the 4 to 5 weeks I have you on rotation with me? Is it time bound again? So again, in the 4 to 5 weeks, are all of those things something that we can actually realistically address in our short period of time together? Really important too is, do we mutually agree on these goals and expectations? So, sometimes, actually oftentimes, many of our learners have really high expectations for themselves, which is, was wonderful. We've all been there. We all really want to do well and work really hard. But unless our preceptors can offer some insight and guide us to, establishing goals and expectations that again are, kind of address all of these SMART pieces is the unfortunate consequence of not doing that is a sense of failure, and that can often be on the side of the learner, which is something that I think we should certainly work towards avoiding. And then most importantly is stay accountable. So SS preceptors, how do we ensure that we're reassessing all of these goals and expectations? Certainly they'll change. They'll change week to week, maybe even day to day. And based on those changes, how can we offer some modifications? I think I just included some examples of goals or expectations that may, or in my opinion, may not fit with our SMART acronym. So one comment or one type of goal and expectation might be, by the end of week 1 of the rotation, the resident will be following the entire unit around independently. Yikes, I think that's kind of an overwhelming goal and expectation, regardless of level of learners. So it's not very specific. It's not really measurable, and more importantly, is this achievable and is this realistic within the time frame that we've defined? And if a learner does not meet this, again, that feeling and the feeling of failure could really be huge and sort of impact the rest of their rotation. So maybe a better example of a SMART goal or expectation is by the end of week 3 of the rotation, the resident will be able to explain drug-specific properties to consider for dose adjustments in CRRT. Again, this is maybe just an example of a goal or expectation that is more in line with our SMART structure. Okay, so thinking about goals and expectations, I kind of thought about them in the bucket of the who, what, and where. So the overarching goals of the learning experience are defined based upon those core competencies and associated activities outlined by ASHP or even ACPE. And so the learning objectives are pretty standard for your type of learning experience. It is very important, however, to review these standard objectives as they apply to every learner and every time. And then I think that there should be a direct discussion of learner-specific goals. Again, referring back to that SMART structure, this is a good time to ensure that we're on the same page. And then noted here is accountability. So how will we reassess? When will we reassess? So are we going to revisit your goals and objectives weekly? I'm a strong proponent that these should be revisited as frequently as is feasible. So I would say minimum weekly at the start of the rotation, revisit them again at midpoint evaluation, and then kind of reflect and wrap up at our final evaluation. And then lastly, our preceptor-specific expectations, which I find to be actually often the most challenging when thinking about that SMART structure. We are all such inherently different practitioners and teachers. We've all trained differently, and our teaching styles are so different. And we have a very different relationship dynamic with each other than we do, let's say, with our learners, who also have different styles, but really, again, that dynamic is really different. What I have found to be particularly challenging is passing on, let's say we've established goals and objectives with our learner on the first day, and then I'm not their preceptor the next day. How can I effectively ensure that I've passed that on to my next preceptor? And then how do they effectively pass that on to the preceptor after them? Sounds like a majority of us work as a team-based approach, so I'm sure that this could be a shared challenge among all of us. So as an example of sort of this as an ongoing piece of feedback that we as a team continue to receive is, again, some disparity in how our preceptors might approach, let's say, the expectation for patient presentations. We had learners tell us, preceptor A required I do one every single day, and then I had a new preceptor the next week who never had me do one. So it was really hard for me to know what I'm supposed to prepare for and things like that. So I think we have really tried to be a little bit more proactive in trying to identify opportunities for preceptors to offer a little bit more close communication with each other and do a little bit more of a focused approach to clear and specific handoff to each other. Are there any questions before moving on about sort of setting goals and expectations before embarking on your learning experience? Okay, great. So the next pillar that I'll talk about is scheduling. And yes, I actually identified scheduling as important enough that it bought itself its own pillar here. Because I think that organization of a learning experience is so key. There are just too many players here. There's too many moving pieces. Things will inevitably fall through the cracks. And ultimately, the people who I think suffer the most if that were to happen are actually our learners. So really keeping up with organization and how to utilize different tools to ensure that from a scheduling piece, everything falls in line as much as possible. Again, nothing's perfect, you know, that's just life. Okay. So I think this was sort of brought up before, but in terms of scheduling and this could be anything, whether it's scheduling the learning experience itself or scheduling activities in your learning experiences, what are some challenges that you all have either faced before or continue to sort of work with currently?
One comment is last-minute rescheduling due to patient care.
Yes, I totally agree. Again, we have so many different priorities in a day. Even though the plan was for us to do a journal club today, I've got 3 last-minute discharges, and those can't wait until we're done with our teaching activities. So, gosh, how do we kind of table that and then make sure that we have the time to reschedule these really important learning activities? Agree, that's super challenging.
Activities taking much longer than anticipated, such as topic discussions or teaching and learning.
Yes, absolutely. We are inherently, and all evidenced by the fact that everyone is here on us at 7 p.m. We are all really devoted to teaching, and we're really dedicated to ensuring that, again, our learners all have a really high quality learning experience. So even just discussing patients who may be very complex, there's a lot of great teaching opportunities there. And then having to do a topic discussion that day in which, again, there's a lot of teaching points. How do we, feasibly establish time points in which we have to kind of say, okay, we have to stop here and move on, so just so we can get through our day. And I know inherently for us, a lot of us aren't comfortable with like, okay, I'm gonna stop teaching you here so we can move on, because we just want to share everything that we possibly can with our learners. I echo that sentiment.
Preceptor continuity for the learners.
Yes, that is definitely something that I find to be superbly challenging as someone who also works with the clinical scheduling for our team, but sometimes it's just not possible. We have a lot of moving pieces again, so how do we honor days off and vacations and things like that, and then avoid someone having a different preceptor every day of the week, which happens, unfortunately. I so that's very much a practical challenge.
Those are all of the comments.
Great, thank you. Again, thanks for bringing up all these challenges. I don't have any answers for you, but I'm happy to hear that some of us are all going through the same things. Again, so based on what everyone has sort of expressed, just highlighting our current climate. We have multiple preceptors, perhaps in even one team. We have multiple layers of learning, and all the while we are balancing a number of patient care activities, including transitions of care. Sometimes I get stuck doing an order for an hour because it's just really complicated and involved, and that really takes away, again, time that I have to spend with our learners. We are all really involved in various committees. We are also really involved with the School of Pharmacy, so I know many of us also help participate in didactic teaching. And then almost, as if this weren't enough, the icing on the cake, although I have it at the very bottom of this, is now in our current climate, Many of us are working remotely. So again, how do we provide an enriching learning experience when I can't really see you in person? And then again, where do I find the space to do all of these learning activities that are required for you? So those are all really challenging things that I think is why also I wanted to speak specifically of scheduling today. So the importance of advanced scheduling. So I map out, I say I, but we map the rotation out on their very first day. So I will say that this piece can be quite time consuming, which is why we try to offload a lot of those other items so that on our first day, we can ensure that we have a solid schedule by the end of day one. And this is really important because advanced scheduling and this organization really ensures accountability for the required or planned learning activities and evaluations that we as preceptors have defined as being essential for the learning experiences. And from the learner perspective, it's our way of reinforcing those expectations. It allows for just coordinating all of these learning activities. All of our residents at some point will be on code coverage, so they are physically bound to the medical center site in which we no longer have any conference rooms available, etc. Learners are busy. They have research days, they have days off, they're at conferences. Preceptors are even more busy, as we've noted, but so how do we kind of align all the stars as best as possible for a single learning experience? So again, this is just an example of the shared rotation calendar that we use for the ICU rotation. So I've captured here our current group of learners, and you can see, so I ask every learner to send us their email accounts, and then we share this with them, and the responsibility, and we make this expectation very clear to them, it is their responsibility to update their calendars with all pertinent activities. So you can see here we have 2 PGY1 residents on with us in our rotation, Adam and Jonathan, and then Gabby and Tiffany are on rotation with us as well, and then we have our APP student, Joe. So we have 5 learners with us currently, and so we've asked them to note everything that could possibly going on in their professional lives in here, so that from a quick snapshot view, I can kind of see, at what point in time would it be reasonable for Adam to do his midpoint. And it seems like, considering all of the preceptor continuity factors and whether Rima is even working that day, these are all kind of things that help map out all of these required learning activities. Let's see. So we, again, use the Google shared calendar and the Google shared account as our method of this shared calendar. But certainly there are other options. So Outlook calendar is really great. And I actually prefer using the Outlook calendar as well, because I find that those calendar invites and reminders are really helpful in keeping us up to date and as nice reminders. And I know a lot of people use the iCloud as well. So there's some other platforms definitely available if this is something that would be helpful. This is just one final example. So in addition to like the rotation to rotation shared calendar, we also actually map out the year-long learner, we call this the learner map. And this is our longitudinal year-long kind of bird's eye view of every human that will be on rotation with us at any time of the year. And this is really nice because it kind of captures what unit would be best suited based on the learner's preference, interest area, preceptor availability, and also being really mindful that there are times when certain ICUs will have multiple layers of learners while other ICUs will not. And so how do we balance that, I don't want to say burden, but how do we balance, it's a little bit more challenging when you have multiple learners on with you rather than single learner or maybe even no learner. So how do we balance that so that one poor preceptor is not, with 2 or 3 learners all year long, and just balance it across the team of existing preceptors. So this is just one last example. So before moving on to our very last pillar, I know we're kind of coming to the last few minutes of the session. I want to be respectful of all your time this evening. Any last minute thoughts or questions before we move on? And this last piece is a little bit on the shorter end. Okay, great. So we're going to wrap up with feedback and evaluations. So we have had CE presentations focused primarily on the art of feedback and evaluation. So most recently, Paul, Alan, and Mandy provided a really wonderful talk about this. So I won't get into the nitty-gritty details because our experts have already shared them with us. However, I do think that setting the tone for those expectations and how we'll approach feedback and completion of evaluations is truly critical to a high quality and meaningful learning experience. I am a proponent of clearly communicating on day one that feedback will be frequent, ongoing, but I just sort of wanted to get a sense of everyone else's approaches to how frequently do you give and receive feedback during your rotation. And again, just in the interest of time, I'll give everyone just a minute to share because I'd love to hear, but I also want to be respectful of everyone's time.
Feedback Friday is a great strategy.
Yes, we'll talk about Feedback Fridays.
Comment says, at the end of a stretch before switching preceptors.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Wrapping up with your learner before someone else kind of takes over, that's really great handoff as well.
Feedback in real time and every Friday during a more formal Feedback Friday session.
Yes, and I'm sorry not to catch anyone short, but this last one is actually perfect timing for what we'll talk about in the next slide. And I'm sorry, but just for the sake of time, I know we all have various challenges and we can voice them maybe towards the end, but we'll move forward for just for the time being. So in terms of the structure of feedback and evaluations, we'll kind of focus on the how, the when, and the where. In terms of the structure, I think the 4 things to keep in mind is the learner self-assessment, the preceptor's assessment, and then the action plan, and then the summary, and really emphasizing that this is a two-way conversation. If and when there may be a discrepancy in how we assess performance or an event, this is absolutely the time to discuss. So I do feel like this always, the importance of this being a two-way conversation is really critical. Again, looping back to what was mentioned about how we or when we give it and how frequently we give it. So someone noted, feedback, I call this feedback on the fly. So I went to a code with you, or, I saw you do this med rec. I think that giving feedback immediately following that event is really important rather than waiting until a more formative setting. A lot of details can get lost if we wait a little bit too long. But even though this might be feedback on the fly, I still like to use this structure and hear the learner self-assessment, offer my own, and from there, create an action plan and sum up. Someone mentioned Feedback Fridays. I'm also a huge proponent of Feedback Fridays. So weekly, and this could be considered more informal feedback. So, at the end of every week, whether a new preceptor is coming on the following week, or we just want to sum up new goals or expectations for Monday, I think this is a really great opportunity to do so. And then most importantly, and perhaps the most challenging right now, is the where to kind of give and receive this type of feedback. Lessons learned from my end is never, if possible, really avoid patient care areas. A lot of really sensitive things, and I think oftentimes in feedback sessions, even for a preceptor, we can often feel like we're in a little bit more of a vulnerable space. So really, when you have a swarm of other people around you, it can be really uncomfortable. So as much as possible, finding a private or a semi-private space, I think, is really important. I am a firm believer that formative evaluations must be scheduled in advance, which is why you can see we added it to our calendar on day 1, because I think that there needs to be adequate time from both parties to have all of their evaluations completed before we meet face-to-face. This was actually a lesson learned from Mandy when I was sort of going through my own teaching rotation. And the reason why this is so important is I'm not sure how many of you all have experienced this, but I certainly have experienced, after a face-to-face formal evaluation in which neither of us had actually completed our evaluations on paper and submitted that. Later, when you go back to co-sign or sign off on that evaluation, your heart drops when you realize that there's items in there that were never brought up to you in their face-to-face meeting. And it's just such a terrible feeling for both parties. So really, these should be done together, and there should really be no surprises when it comes to signing off on each other's evaluations. A current challenge that I'm facing is that if you have multiple learners on at one time, how do you approach providing feedback, even if it's informal? And I think that my approach is really not to do those together. Again, sometimes people can feel a little bit more vulnerable, and or we provide both positive and perhaps feedback for areas of improvement. And I think it offers perhaps an opportunity for learners to feel uncomfortable if they know that their co-resident or another learner is present with them. So that's always something to actually explicitly communicate and ask, like, would you like this person to be here? Or would you like to do this privately? So that's always something that I like to also include. So in terms of feedback, there's the feedback for our learners, feedback for our preceptors, and then the learning experience. And then we're wrapping up in just a minute. So the feedback for the learning experience is super important. I think it's really important to solicit feedback about the structure of the learning experience from both learners and preceptors. So Rebecca sort of brought this up earlier in terms of how frequently do you go back and assess, all of those onboarding materials. And so I think that this is an ongoing process. And something I've even learned by that question has prompted me is perhaps we should better define how often we're going back to revisit this. Because, it doesn't make any sense for us to do all this work and have our learners do all these items in the checklist when really they find that it's, bogging them down, or they don't find it effective, etc. Another sort of important piece to learn from this is that, we should be open to trialing new methods. One, method or solution that, we've been using now for, let's say, 5 years, doesn't mean it's going to necessarily continue to work today. So one size most certainly doesn't fit all, and adjustments are definitely necessary. We have a very actively changing learning climate as well as professional climate. So, adjusting accordingly, I think, is really important. So just to sum up, things that we kind of talked about today and highlighted is really thinking about utilizing productivity tools to optimize standardized approach to learner onboarding and orientation. As preceptors, as much as possible, establishing very clear learner-specific and measurable goals for the learning experience and revisit it regularly. How can we develop a mechanism to establish organization for the learning experience? And how can that then enhance both our learner and preceptor accountability? How can we think about integrating feedback that is timely, structured, and a two-way conversation? And how can we ensure that we're soliciting adequate feedback to strengthen the learning experience and be open to trialing new methods? So I'm sorry to rush to the very end. Thank you all so much for hanging out until 7:22, but I'm happy to take any questions at this time. And I just want to thank all of you again for participating tonight and really actively participating in the discussion and offering your insights as well.
While everyone's thinking of their questions, Sue, thank you for taking the time to put this together and present this excellent sort of summary of all of these very delicate pieces that we work together to try and make the best learning experience possible for our students and our residents and all of our learners that are on our rotations. I think this is really excellent. This is a really good summary, and I think a lot of people will find it useful.
Thank you, Dexter.
I just see lots of thank yous. I don't see any comments, so I think off the hook here.
Awesome. Thank you all again so much for joining us. I appreciate you. I know that these are precious hours, so I hope everyone has a really great evening and hope to see you all in person maybe even soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sue. I will be sending out an email to everyone with instructions on how to claim your CE credit and to fill out an evaluation. So please do that by September the 24th. And I will also be publishing this as a recording so that anybody could listen to it should they want to. Thank you all.